Well, it's 3 minutes after, and I want to welcome everyone to our webinar. As a reminder, December 4th through the 8th in New Orleans, Louisiana is the 2022 Coastal and Historian Summit hosted by Ray. I'm excited to see everyone there. Please, 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 if you haven't, register now. Looking forward to this event. Next slide, please. And so, welcome to our Inclusive Coast Initiative, building partnerships with your community. I also work as Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Earth Justice and Environmental Law Organization, and partnerships are so key to the work, to our mission. So, I'm really looking forward to this conversation on building partnerships with your community. Next slide, please. So, today, we're going to have introductions. So please introduce yourself in the chat. Start with your name, your pronouns, location and organization, and as an icebreaker question, what is your favorite natural space and why? So my name is Philip McAdoo. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm located, I actually work out of our DC office, but I'm currently at my home office in Silver Spring, Maryland. So you may hear some dogs, you may hear some birds, you may hear whatever's running in the backyard, which leads me to my favorite natural space and why is, a couple of years ago, we moved out of Washington, D.C. And we found this great little piece of property in Silver Spring, actually near Olney, Maryland. And we have a pond, we have lots of great outdoor space. So I love walking around with the dogs. I love just sitting at the window and seeing what flies out. My friends are teasing me and said I've become a bird person because I have binoculars by my desk. I'm like, oh, there's a really beautiful bird. So that's my favorite natural space. So if you could, in the chat, say your name, your pronouns, your location and organization, and what is your favorite natural space and why? Oh, I see Hannah Brown. Hi, Hannah. What is it? Something Florida and Tennessee. What is it? Anicia? Anicia? Hi, Anicia. National Association of Conservative Districts, Maine. Susan Park. Hi, Susan. Favorite natural space, any beach. I agree. Favorite natural space are, I can't pronounce that, but Annika, what is that? That looks great. Spangam Bogs. And then someone said South Georgia coast. Yes, we used to live in Atlanta. Spent a lot of time visiting the South Georgia coast. It's really great. NOAA Restore Science Program. Thank you so much, Hannah. Hi, Courtney. Galveston Bay Foundation, Texas. Yes. Uh, Hi, Suzanne. Got you. Hi, Victoria. That's great. Santa Cruz. Yes. Laura, Todd, Rockville. Yeah, Rockville. You're my neighbor, Laura. Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Keep those coming. It really is great. We're excited to be here. We're excited to be a part of this conversation. Candace said something about North Carolina. See, I'm from North Carolina too. Candace is already my favorite person on this call. Some great forested areas, so I spend a lot of time hiking them. Great. Uh, Asheville, North Carolina is one of my favorite places, Candace. I grew up a couple of hours from there. So great. Let's go on to our next slide. Keep your introductions coming. Looking forward to welcoming you all into this conversation. So we just had our introductions. Next, we're going to do some shared agreements and workshop overview. Then we'll do the concept overview. Oh, back one more second, Rod. Let me finish that. And then we'll do the featured speaker, which is Heidi Nutters. We'll do a Q&A, and then we'll wrap up. I want to give a special shout out to Samaya Rubio, who is our community engagement associate. Did a lot of work for us today on this webinar and is not feeling well, so she can't be with us. So Samaya is sending you some healing thoughts. Again, I'm Philip McAdoo, an Inclusive Coast Initiative Senior Advisor. I'm looking forward to being your host for today. Next slide, please. So with any conversation, we like to enter it with some shared agreements just to protect people's privacy and make it a really safe and inclusive space. So we ask that you be curious, open, and respectful. Practice self-care. Take the time that you need. If you need to be off camera, if you need to grab water, sure. No one knows everything. Together we know a lot. Again, maintain confidentiality. Speak from your own experience. Take space, make space. So just be mindful of the time that you're taking up space and make space for others. Challenge assumptions, your own assumptions. Be conscious of intent versus impact of your words and actions. Dismantling systems of oppression benefits everyone, and opposing systems of oppression, building alternatives, and cultural change are all necessary. So, those are some shared agreements. If there's anything else that you like to use in this context, feel free to add it in the chat, and we'll be mindful of it as we proceed. Next slide, please, Rob. And so, what is a successful partnership? As I shared earlier, I worked for an environmental organization, Earth Justice, and actually, partnership is one of our key values. Like, really being thoughtful about the people that we work closely alongside, those people who are in those frontline communities. How do we engage them? What's our approach? We're just coming off an all staff meeting where over 450 people from our organization came together over the last 4 days. And one of the conversations we had was about partnerships. Are we positioning ourselves as heroes? How do we position our clients, our partners, as heroes of their own stories? So, from your perspective, and please feel free to type into the chat, what does a successful partnership look like? What does a successful partnership look like? Again, in the work that we do at Earth Justice, it really is about empowering our clients, our partners, viewing them as leaders, working closely alongside them so that we're able to tell their stories in an accountable and equitable way, positioning them to be able to tell their stories in an accountable and equitable way. So, what does a successful partnership look like? If you think about the scope of your work, if you think about the mission, vision, and goals of the organizations that you work with, you represent, what does a successful partnership look like? If people can just share their thoughts in the chat, that would be great. One of the things that we talk about a lot too at Earth Justice is our role as people that are working alongside community leaders, community activists. How do we maintain those partnerships? Yes, power balance. Power balance is so true. Equal decision making among all. I hear that a lot. Thank you so much, Victoria. Equal decision, inclusivity, diverse voices, all partners contributing their top skills to make a project happen. A collaborative process where parties are working together to form mutually beneficial ideas and projects. Collaborative is so great. I think that's one of the things that I'm constantly learning more about. What does it mean to be a collaborative leader? Give and take, acknowledging everyone has unique strengths to offer. Thank you so much, Rob. Success is deep engagement with those involved and leveraging their local connection, experiences, and knowledge for broader success while maintaining space for others to continue to join. Thank you so much. Anika, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I'm sorry if I am not. I love that success equals deep engagement with those involved and leveraging their local connections, experiences, and knowledge for broader success while maintaining space for others to continue to join. As one of our community leaders that joined us says, also it means paying us, paying people for their knowledge, for their experiences, for what they're sharing. Mutual understanding of the unique strengths each brings to the table and the distinct roles each will carry out. So that's great. I love this notion of the ways that we're thinking about successful partnerships, and even when partnerships have not been successful, what are we able to learn? What are we able to take to our next partnership? And how do we build those relationships? And also sometimes to repair. It may sometimes if things happen and you're building a partnership and there's trust there, like how do you rebuild that trust? So lots of wonderful things to think about. Thank you all for sharing those. Next slide, please. Assessing stakeholder and rights holders' needs. That's great. So we'll start with some definitions and understanding of those two terms. Next slide, please. The stakeholder definition is stakeholders are individuals and organizations that have an interest in or are affected by your evaluation and or its results. It's from the CDC. So stakeholders are individuals and organizations that have an interest in or affected by your evaluation and or its results. So if you have an example of a stakeholder, be thinking about that. We can share that later. So how is this different from a rights holder? A rights holder or right holders are individuals or social groups having particular entitlements in relation to specific duty barriers. That's from the University of Oulu in Finland. Again, rights holders are individuals or social groups having particular entitlements in relation to specific duty bearers. So again, be thinking about the relationships between stakeholders and rights holders. I'd love to you to start sharing some of those in the chat. Next slide, please. Here we go. What are stakeholders and right holders need examples? So we have sometimes it feels that stakeholder and right holders are terms that tend to dehumanize, depersonalize the value of interpersonal relationships vital to collaboration. Do you have terms on more meaningful terms? I do not, but thank you so much for adding that. That is a really important distinction to make. Sometimes it feels that stakeholders and right holders are terms that tend to dehumanize and depersonalize. And if folks have any ideas in terms of what stakeholders and right holders are outside of these terms, I'd love for you to share that in the chat. Thank you for that. Terms that feel more meaningful, right? In terms of partnerships, in terms of being in relationships. Victoria, a lot of people agree. Yes, let's push that more. What are some other ways that we can think about stakeholders and right holders' needs? It feels very cold as I'm reading it. It feels very cold. Sometimes best practices or language that we use to frame these conversations often can go deeper to a more, to your point, humanized approach. So I'm wondering if folks have any other things that resonate or come up when you hear stakeholders and right holders. Um, Stakeholders and right holders, and being really deliberate and intentional on how we frame the two. Rob, let's go back to the previous slide where we can see those definitions and see if there's any other words or different ways that we can think about the terms that we're using. Individuals and organizations that have an interest in or affected by your evaluation and or its results. What other terms could we use to talk about stakeholders? What are some of the other words that resonates? Interested party or interested people? Be better language, says Susan. All folks in partnership be interested. I like partnership. I think there's something in this in terms of partnership. People usually default to partnership, which makes sense. Um, Partners and partnerships. I guess it also speaks to the hierarchy, right? To those power dynamics, some visible and some not so visible when we think about how we are being in community and how we build those relationships. It really, I can't imagine someone going into a community saying, I'm a stakeholder. Oh, I'm pretty sure it happens, but it doesn't feel like a really inclusive, collaborative approach to being in partnership and being in relationship, to have these terms that feel kind of hierarchical. Stakeholders, rights holders. So partners. So it sounds like we're landing on a partner or some phrasing or some terms that set folks up on equal grounds. And I think that's really interesting if you go back to your organizations to think about the language that you use, to think about the ways that you enter into community. And to use this as an example, we were in this webinar and something terms that were shared with us didn't feel like it was really holding or grounding or speaking to the nature of being in true partnership, especially in community, especially vulnerable communities. So what are some ways that we can think about our approach? We can think about how we are naming and labeling as we aim to build trust in those moments. So thank you all so much for your feedback on that. Next slides, please, Rob. Intersectional partnerships and support. This is one of my favorite words, intersectional. So we'll go to some definitions and understanding on intersectional partnerships and support. Next slide, please. So intersectionality definition. Intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. Is not simply that there's a race problem here, a gender problem here, and a class or LGBTQ problem there. Many times that framework erases what happens to people who are subject of all those things. Kimberly Crenshaw, I love Kimberly Crenshaw and her work on intersectionality, often framed around race, gender, and other identities and where they intersect, and how a person holds those different identities. And so, how can we bring this concept into our partnership requests and our work? Intersectionality. How can we bring this concept into our partnership requests and work? Collaborator. I see Susan. Collaborator. Also, when working on collaborative science partnerships, we have identified stakeholders as end users to acknowledge that our work is to support the needs of those partners, but perhaps it's depersonalizing it as well. Thank you, Suzanne, for that. And what are the intersections, right? What are the ways that we can think about intersectionality as it pertains to partnership in our work? Like, what are those connections? At Earth Justice, we're always talking about the environmental justice versus, racial justice versus all the different ways that folks are marginalized and how that is impacted in our work and how that is contributes to environmental justice. So not separating them two. And what's been so great about what's happened since 2020 is there's been a huge reckoning on race, and we're now starting to see the intersectionalities of racial justice, environmental justice, noting that environmental justice or environmental injustice has a disproportionate impact on poor people, marginalized communities. So, what are some of the ways that we can start to think about our partnership or the concept of intersectionality in the partnership requests and our work? Feel free to share anything that comes up in the chat or just to jot this down as a question to take back to your organizations. How can we bring this concept of intersectionality into our partnership requests and our work? One of my favorite words, intersectionality. Next slide, please. Great. Now it's time to welcome our featured guests. So please have your questions ready. There'll be a Q&A at the end. Heidi Nutters, Program Manager, leads Wetland Regional Monitoring Program Process and the Transforming Urban Water Initiative. Her work includes leading collaborative program development, advancing on-the-ground, nature-based shoreline infrastructure projects, and integrating racial equity into partnerships projects. Prior to joining the partnership, she managed the coastal training program for the San Francisco Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. She supported climate adaptation and restoration efforts at the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission and invasive species management and research programs at Brown University. She received a BA in Cultural and Interdisciplinary Studies from Antioch College and an MA in Environmental Studies from Brown University. Please welcome Heidi Nutters.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you doing
I'm
today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us. This is not one of our scheduled questions, but I just want to pick your brain since it came up in terms of stakeholders. Anything that resonated with you when we think about those terms and rights holders?
Yeah, that was a really interesting. I was really enjoying the chat, and the term rights holders is new to me, but I my one of the things I was thinking about is how do you acknowledge like resource dependent communities, which I think would be
Yeah,
rights holders. Um, but I did like the term partners or collaborators that I saw in the chat for stakeholders, and I do think the term stakeholder can be a little depersonalizing. So I
yeah,
appreciated that question.
yeah. Me too. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your feedback on that. And Heidi, just to start off, I was wondering, what was your journey to DEIJ or EJ work? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, so I am a person I've always been interested in that intersection of communities and environmental well-being. And so, when I first got interested in kind of the realm of environmental and, natural resource management, it was because I was helping with an assessment of the marine protected areas here in California, and was interviewing recreational fishermen about their perspectives of the ocean planning process, and just hearing how frustrated they were at the time, and really understanding, like, from my young idealistic brain, here was this amazing ocean planning effort that was doing, that had all the right objectives. So why was this really important partner, people that are on the water every day, having such concern? And it just sparked my interest in how we have built trust and are in relationship with each other as partners in the process. So um, in my graduate work at Brown, I was really interested in the role of multi-generational fishing families in ocean planning work in New England, and was really struck by how much knowledge they held of the ocean. That, like, maybe in our careers we can hold 10 or 15 or 20 years of knowledge through our experience, and then you have these people on the water that have generations of knowledge that they're living, and how much that can contribute to our understanding of change, climate
Mm,
change and systems change. And so coming to the Bay Area, I became really interested in environmental justice in my own backyard. This is where I'm from. I was born and raised in San Francisco. And one thing that's been wonderful is seeing so much more organizational support for equity and for DEI work within organizations. I felt like the first half of my career, I was kind of always fighting to bring it to projects. And now it's, expected. And there's so much more capacity at the agency level. Um, and so, it's a fascinating area to work in. And, I feel like I learn every day, like, even just like I said in the chat, seeing people's perspectives, I was like, oh, wow, that's really interesting. So, for me, it's been about finding ways to build it into all of the areas of my work, to continue to center it, and to be in a learning process with it, so that's what I would say.
yeah, that's great. And you started to touch on this, but how does equity inform your work, like having that lens?
Well, I think, like I said, for me, equity is central, and when I was thinking about that question, one example that came to mind was here in the Bay Area in 2016. The voters passed Measure AA, which funds $25 million per year for restoration in the Bay. And the reason that the voters, which was, they had to get a majority vote in all 9 counties, right? So that was like a really heavy lift. And, why are communities voting for restoration? They're voting
Mm,
for it because it supports, because they believe in the intrinsic value of, nature and, species protection. And also because when we have nature that's thriving around us, it supports the well-being of our communities. And because I think people understand that frontline communities are going to be disproportionately affected, and that we need to protect our shorelines, and find ways to protect those communities in the process. So, I feel like we do a disservice when we don't put equity front and center, because, leaders from frontline communities are some of the largest advocates for restoration, for protection of health of the estuary. And so it informs my work in every way. And like I said, it just builds on it. And I work for the San Francisco Estuary Partnership, which is a national estuary program, an NEP, of which there are, I think, 26 across the US. And so I think it also informs my work by kind of knowing how I'm situated. So as an NEP, we work as a bridge organization. And in that, position, we're able to kind of push the envelope with our partners, bring people together, build bridges around equity. So it also informs my work through the lens of just where I'm situated, where I see that as being part of my role. So if I'm working to develop a local multi-benefit, shoreline project, right, where we're building a wetland, I can help a local government that's already, overextended, understaffed, to think through how can we stack more benefits for communities. What would tribes be interested in for this project? What would the frontline communities that are right next door, how can they benefit from this project? Can we think about recreational amenities through a lens of, of through those lenses? Can we think about a land acknowledgement at the site? So really just trying to continually bring it to the table, and especially in places where I'm not seeing it.
yeah, yeah, those are really great and important questions. I think even, building in those questions into your process can really expand how you're thinking about and approaching the work. So thank you for that. Um,
Mhm.
do you have any examples of partnerships you've built in your career, and how you've maintained those?
Yeah, definitely a lot of partnerships. I think this work that we all do is fundamentally about relationships. And, I think that is really how I see partnership building, is being in relationship, and that it is a long-term investment. And I know that can sometimes be challenging for our work, because sometimes we're, funded under, a short period of time through a grant to do a project, and we need to build a partnership in order to do that. And personally, as I've grown in this work, I've really tried to think more strategically about how I build partnerships. And so instead, thinking about those long-term investments and being in relationship, because it's so much about trust, going back to those fishing communities and the distrust, and that is so there with frontline communities, with Black and Brown communities, with tribal communities. And so we have to work within that context. So we have to work to build trust, because government agencies have broken trust for generations with these communities. So it's part of our work to build the trust as we do the work. So one example that we have through a project that was funded by EPA a few years ago is in a community called North Richmond, which is in the East Bay of the Bay Area, if you know, just north of Berkeley. And this is a community actually that was a red line community from, many years ago, traditionally African-American community within the Bay Area. And one, like I said, that has really deep cultural fabric, and, that has experienced generations of, unfair practices through planning and, like I said, redlining and things of this nature. So we were funded to go in and start to work on building trust and thinking about how we can develop projects on the shoreline that center the voices of the community. And we realized that in order to do that, first we needed to take a step back from the project lens and develop a vision together. So we went to the community, we interviewed people, we created this map that was in multiple languages to try to understand how people were using the shoreline and how they would how they're experiencing shoreline change and what they would like to see in the future. So that was the North Richmond Shoreline Vision. We talked to teacher groups, we brought students in, we talked to church groups, we talked to groups that maybe we normally, wouldn't have talked to, but kind of met people where they were at, to try to hear from as many folks from the community as we could. And what's been wonderful is that the Shoreline Vision was completed and a few years ago, and now we have these projects that we're seeing go through planning, go through development and implementation with the backing of communities. So we can move to the project phase feeling confident that we've listened, that we heard the concerns, that they looked at the projects, they gave us their input, and now we can move forward with them. And so there are several shoreline projects that are being developed in really close partnership with some of these local community-based organizations. And so again, it's that long-term investment in a place and in the relationships that have been built there. Another example I wanted to mention is, so like you said in my intro, I work a lot on nature-based shoreline adaptation projects. So, really working with communities on, horizontal levees or other kinds of nature-based projects. And we have one in the city of Palo Alto. And in that case, we were working to build relationships with tribes. And in the Bay Area, this is an interesting topic because we don't have tribes that have federal recognition, except in one part of the Bay that in the North Bay in Sonoma County. Most of the tribes here do not have federal recognition and are in disagreement among each other about traditional homelands and things of that nature. So working with tribes can be tricky because we need to understand that context when coming in. Partnering with one tribe might be perceived as taking a kind of stand on traditional homelands of an area. So with this project, we were trying to foster those tribal relationships to try to understand how can a nature-based project include, for example, plants that are culturally relevant to tribes, or even have an area for harvesting of those plants within the project itself, so that they could benefit from the project more directly. So that's another example of, kind of a more unique partnership that we've built, and really thinking about, how we design projects, like who should be the beneficiaries. Is it about species? Is it about habitat? Is it about wastewater? Can we add in these other elements? Can we add in cultural benefits? Can we add in amenities for communities? So really just thinking about how we can layer things on top of each other. So those are some of the kind of, in more recent years, examples that I can give. There's a lot of them, and the partnership that I work with, almost everyone on the staff could probably, give you a talk, because we have amazing capacity on this. So just we're really in a dynamic learning space with it all. But yeah, those are some examples that come to mind.
I like that, being in this dynamic learning space. And so, what are some of the most important things that you all consider when you're building a new partnership with an organization? You talked about, maintaining the relationships, but what are some of the things that are most important when building a new partnership?
I think that one of the kind of lessons learned that I have is that being really clear on your role and your capacity. So it's really important when building a relationship to, in my experience, to not necessarily come with an open slate. So if you're going to a tribe and you're like a tribal group, and you're like, here's a project, what do you want? Do you want it like let's, anything you want, you can have. That's not necessarily going to be the most generative discussion, because they're trying to build trust with your organization. Who are you? What are the priorities of the project? They might not be experts on, nature-based shoreline projects. And so kind of trying to already have done the work, already try to understand your partner, do the research, do informational interviews, talk to folks who maybe have been in partnership with that organization, so that you're not coming in with that at zero, but maybe just a little bit farther in the process. I also try to, so being clear on your role and your sort of capacity and your ask. I think somebody wrote in the chat, resources. It's really important to pay people for their time. Super crucial. And as somebody who writes a lot of grants, I can say, I've never had pushback from a grantor, a funder who's like, what is the stipend budget that you've got? I consider it a best practice. I always write in a budget for stipends and honorariums, and just pay people. It really helps. I also really try to come into like new partnerships with a lens of cultural humility, really trying to just know that I don't know everything about, that person's lived experience. I'm here to learn and to listen. And, also building cultural competency as a really important component of DEI that I don't think we talk about as much in like kind of the estuarian health space. So, for me, I'm always asking, like, what does it mean to be like a holder of knowledge, because as we do more DEI work, hopefully what we're seeing is, more representation on our boards, on our, advisory committees, on our decision-making committees. And I've seen, examples of pushback of that, where you're, if you're bringing, folks from marginalized communities or from tribes in, they're going to have something different to say maybe than what you have traditionally seen on that board. So really practicing cultural humility and around and being willing to recalibrate. So if somebody's coming in and they're saying something that doesn't seem like it's what's been considered before, being willing to pivot. We've said we want to center equity. Now we have it. So being willing to change and shift priorities based on the voices that are at the table. Yeah, I think those are some things I would say, and I'd be interested in, other thoughts as well. There's a lot of best practices.
Yeah, yeah, and folks, feel free to share in the chat. I have one more question, and then we'll
Yeah.
open it up. Just, well, one and a half. Cultural humility. Can you speak a little bit more, Heidi, in terms of what that looks like? Because I think that's a big one that we tend to miss when we start thinking about our partnership work. Cultural humility. Can you say more about that?
I think for me, I mean, I don't know, I don't have like an official definition,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah,
I think for me, it's about being in a place of listening,
yeah,
of not making assumptions, about not, that sometimes when we come in as representatives of these big organizations, we don't necessarily even know the weight. And somebody had mentioned power dynamics in the chat,
yeah,
the power dynamics at play in just representing a big organization that's funding, millions and millions, maybe, when you're talking to a small CBO that maybe doesn't even have a bookkeeper, right? And
yeah,
it's like
yeah,
one or two staff. So just like being aware of those power dynamics and like taking, I don't know, I was going to say it in non-official ways, I'd sort of say like just managing like your energy kind of in those
yeah,
situations,
yeah,
trying to match the where meet people where they're at,
yeah.
and not make assumptions. Yeah, that's how I'd describe it.
Yeah, I think that listening part is key, especially, those of us who hold a particular vantage point, that being able to set that aside and to really do some deep listening is really what cultural humility means to me. So thank you so much for that. And then
Yeah.
finally, Heidi, I'm so
Oh,
go ahead.
go ahead.
Mm-mm.
Oh, I was just going to add something about that, which is mentioning the partnering with the small CBOs, and what that means is that, like I said, that pivot sometimes means, like, I've worked with CBOs where they say, sure, we'd love to partner with you. We'd love to receive that money, but we don't like, we're having trouble figuring out how we can invoice you because, like I said, we don't have a bookkeeper. How do you calculate an hourly rate? So, like, really, that's also what it means, is like,
Yeah,
in situations like that, not don't say no. Be like, well, let's talk about it. Let's spend a half an hour talking that through on the
yeah,
phone.
yeah,
Because those barriers to entry can be really major
yeah.
for community groups. But sorry for interrupting you.
No, no, no. I was great. I was just gonna go to the next question, but I think that resonates, and that's really important to know that oftentimes we are dealing with folks with limited resource, or working in partnership with folks with limited resources, or whose resources look differently. And so really being flexible, and just taking the time to honor the many different ways to be in this partnership, this new
Yeah.
relationship. So thank you for that. And finally, how do you begin the process of institutional change in an organization? Any advice for people who are just starting now to really ask these questions or to take this approach to their work? How do you begin the process of institutional change?
Yeah, that is such a good question. And the first thing I wrote down was start anywhere, go everywhere. Because,
Mm,
equity, it touches everything that we do. There's no wrong place to start. I think that it's more about letting it, but I think the challenge can be the flexibility that's required to let it ripple and impact all of the parts of an organization. So really letting, IDing that change at all levels, from the project level to how we engage with partners to our decision making bodies. And also, it's a long game thing, and so sometimes that change can be incremental, and sometimes you can take big steps.
yeah,
Definitely getting DEI training is super crucial and on an ongoing basis. Being willing to have hard conversations as a staff. And I think one of the things that I've learned about equity is that it kind of forces us all to bring ourselves a little bit more to work. I think, like, it sort of takes down some of the professional barriers, because it's personal for people. It's like, that's that intersectional piece that you mentioned, right? Like, we can't separate ourselves from the things that are going on in our communities or in our own families. And so, like, as leaders or as staff that are leading discussions around that, finding ways to have framework for conversation, safe spaces, because it, like I said, it's personal. So having hard conversations as a staff, bringing and letting yourself bring a little bit more of yourself to your work. What about equity is it touches you as a person that would inspire you to center it within your work, you know? Um, yeah, that's what I'd say.
I like that. Start anywhere, go everywhere. I'm going to make a t-shirt. I'm going to quote. Did I quote you? I might borrow your quote, but it's
Sounds
beautiful.
good.
Just, really start anywhere, go everywhere in terms of creating those touch points with people, getting some of just the knowledge that's really rooted in those communities is really important. So we're going to open it up for Q&A. If you have any questions, read it in the chat. I mean, I love this part of what I do because I could talk all day. Heidi, thank you so much just for your insight. I mean, there was a lot of different shifts that I've heard, especially around cultural humility, like what that means. Start anywhere, go everywhere, and just bring more of yourself. bring more of yourself into this work, which I think is really important. We talk about being vulnerable. We talk
Mhm.
about modeling that, especially in these communities. Something that's been really, I've heard a lot of conversation around is like, how do you enter into these spaces with some sort of reckoning of the past? And so I've been in conversations with people who are like, we have to apologize for all the horrible things that white people have done before we enter into these communities. And I tested that with some of my community leaders, and they're like, oh, that's one way, but we know that you're here, like the fact that you're here. So some of that can land as a little awkward for them, but
Mhm.
just really, I think that's the work that we do internally, right? We get really clear in terms of what potential harms our organizations have done in the past and how we reckon that as an organization, so that when we show up in these communities, we're as authentic as we can possibly be, and there isn't a need to explain away why we're there, because people are there to do the work, right? They 99% of folks are like, we don't care how you've done with X, Y, and Z. Like, we want to be here to really be in partnership with you.
Yeah, and just, I mean, I have definitely had conversations with leaders where you have to have a thick skin, you know?
Yeah,
Maybe there was people in your organization in the past that are no longer there, that you have no, you have no idea even who they are,
yeah,
but there was some trust broken, or
mm,
and that maybe for you that feels like something that's disconnected, but for that
yeah,
person it's not. It's inherently connected. And I've also been, like, for example, we were doing a series of listening sessions for a grant program, and I was just sitting there taking notes, and one of the folks in the room was like, we have had so many people come into our community and just take and then walk away. Put your notebook
mm,
away. And I was like, you know what? That's totally fair. So being, put my notebook away, just there to listen. So
yeah,
it's tricky sometimes, but
yeah,
learning how to not take that personally, and it can be challenging, and it's like a muscle that we build, of
yeah, yeah.
trying to build, yeah,
I,
kind
I
of.
love that it No, I love that example, Heidi. I remember being on a site visit on a reservation, and I had a camera with
Mhm.
me. And as we started the res tour, I pulled it out of the bag, and then I heard one of the participants say, "Oh, that's where my grandmother lives." And they were starting to, and I was like, I'm not going to be the person that pulls out a big ass camera and just makes this about. So I'm so glad my instincts were to what you point out, were just to listen and just to be connected in that moment, instead of this weird, like, um I don't know, it was just strange. So that really resonated with me when you shared that. Like, how do we show up in those spaces, and how we're just able to just be.
Mhm.
Please, if you have any questions in the chat, please share those. My dogs are seeing a fox walk across our backyard, so they may rear up in a second. But Anika says, Anika, I really appreciate the point on being ourselves. The partners I engage with show up as their whole selves, and I try to model that in kind. Great, great, great. Any other questions? Uh, Here's one. Have you gotten any pushback from traditional, for lack of a better word, primarily white, male, wealthy partners as you've expanded outreach and engagement in your communities? Thank you for that question. Any
Yeah.
pushback?
So here's a place where I've seen pushback, and that is, I think that within my field, at least, there's this idea that science is what drives our decision making. And that is one area where I have seen pushback, right? So if you're talking to a community member and they're not a scientist, then for the kind of like, I don't, as you described, type of person, I have personally seen pushback. And I think that has been one of my long game pieces, is really advocating for the social sciences, advocating for lived experience and personal perspectives as being on par with our science. So really, I would offer that of sort of like questioning, if you have a science-based decision-making process, then that inherently can create barriers. And I'm not like against that in any way. We need the science in order to inform our decision making. But I hope that you all can understand how that framing it almost like inherently comes up against folks that are non-scientists that you're asking to then engage in the process. So yes, I have seen that. I think that it is an kind of outgoing way of thinking, and that I'm so encouraged by younger generations of people that are coming like right out of school into this work. They inherently see those connections. And it's what we can do is, like I said, to continue to advocate for different ways of knowing what it means to be a holder of knowledge or to be an expert on something. So just thinking through those organizational norms that we set is a way to help kind of center the many ways that we know, including scientists that we absolutely need at the table in our work that we do.
That's great. Thank you so much for that, Heidi. Thank you for that question. One more question. What would you suggest for someone in an organization who doesn't feel their colleagues are doing enough in their outreach, but don't have the positional authority to change it?
Someone who doesn't have the authority to change it. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that part of it kind of goes back to the topic of the webinar, which is inclusive conversations, right? And the ways that we create forums for that. I really personally in my work try to really uplift emerging leaders. So if they don't have the position to change it, can you help to support linking them up with a mentor who might be willing to listen to their concerns and help center those in the right conversations? Can you host a discussion group with your staff around best practices for outreach and engagement, and create a really inclusive forum for all people to speak, including, junior people on your staff or people who, are not in positions of authority. So I think that, in my experience, you don't have to be a director level to say, hey, I'd like to host a discussion about, best practices for outreach. And really, as you started this, where you had those norms, for this discussion, modeling that and trying to encourage those people. Some, like I said, some of the, younger people in our field are the best advocates for this sort of intersectional approach to engagement because it's considered best practice right now. So I think we can all help with that for sure, although it can be tricky. Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. And Cora, it may help too, just to reflect back some of the things that you've heard today, in a really curious way. I went to this webinar here, some questions that were shared. What does this look like in our organization? Or do you have any sense of how this would play out within our community? We're going to do one last question, see if we can get it to maybe a 90-second answer, Heidi. Can you
Okay.
share some of the specific ways that you have reached out to previously unserved or underserved communities and community-based organizations, ways that are authentic and don't seem performative? So what are some of the authentic ways that you've reached out to some of your partners that don't seem performative?
I mean, that's a hard one because I think we all have to kind of watch that. I try not to, until we have a well-established partnership with an organization that is funded and is working with us in a funded capacity, I really wouldn't advertise most of the relationship building that you're doing, and until it's also reflected within your decision making body. So if you're partnering with a tribe, but there's no tribal representative on your board, are you really partnering with a tribe? So that's a way to work against that. And, you know, I've definitely worked with organizations that didn't have that kind of representation and tried to build partnerships. And the partners were like, no, we don't see people of color on your board. So we don't want to partner with you. That's performative. So I think it's just about that advocacy work and that care and kind of being conscientious of how your organization is perceived and centering those voices at every level. So I don't know if that was 90 seconds, but it was as fast as I could go.
No, it was great, and thank you so much for that. Thank you for that wonderful question, and Heidi, thank you so much for spending time with us today. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to learning more about the work that you're doing and anything that we can do to support you at Ray or at Earth Justice, where I work as well. Please let me know. So everyone, next slide, Rob, we can pull our slides up. I think we have just a few more announcements to make before we move on. Again, we have our December 4th through 8th. Actually, before I get to that announcement, we have our next webinar on designing your program, November 2nd. That's 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, designing your program. That's our final in a series of 3 webinars. And finally, we want to remind you all about the Ray Summit coming up December 4th through 8th in New Orleans. I'll be there. A lot of the Ray team will be there. We're looking forward to some wonderful, wonderful conversations. Again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for being here. We hope that you've learned something that you can share and take back to your communities, especially some of those questions like how do we get started? Please feel free to take any of these points back and just kind of share it with your team or with people in your organization. And just be curious about what does this look like at our organization. On that note, have a wonderful, wonderful weekend, and we will see you all in November. Take care. Bye bye.